الحمد لله وكفى والصلاة على عباده الذين اصطفى. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Again, I'd like to thank Dr. Asim Padella, Dr. Afifi for inviting me here. I've had a fantastic weekend. Really opened up my mind and met up with some quite amazing people from similar kind of areas, but yet very different. So, alhamdulillah, a lot of diversity, a lot of contrast and comparison was made in terms of the work that we're doing. Now, the presentation that the presentation that I'm going to be delivering, in essence, is quite detailed and is approximately 56 slides. But I've condensed it down to approximately 10. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through the key elements of discussion. And I'm sure you have a whole stream of questions already for me, even before I get to that chair. So, inshallah, I'll try my best. Please bear with me if any part of this is not clear, because, like again, I've already wasted 3 minutes just saying that. Okay, right. Before I get into the detail, I just want to say a few things. Okay. Now, this slide, I'll keep it on for a short while so that you can actually read it. And I really want you to absorb this, okay? So we have Ibn Qudama, we have Hassan Basri, we have Imam Nawawi, we have Ibn Rushd. And this last one, Ibn Abidin, who is quite a recognized Hanafi scholar, a Damascene Hanafi scholar. And his kitab, which we call Shami, as its sort of other current name, is a very popular kitab in the Hanafi fiqh. The school, and a lot of the Hanafi muftis do tend to make reference to this particular kitab. But the main point here is that when there was a need now, there is a real need now, or there has been a real need for some time now, to really come to some real detail and some serious conclusion about what is death from an Islamic perspective. Okay, we've had some amazing amounts of development in our modern technology. And that technology has taken us to quite serious heights. So if we look at it from the historical perspective, I mean, we need to really contrast this because history is very important here. You look through a historical perspective, you will see that people perceive death in very many different ways. And there were many different types of rituals, religious and cultural and various other rituals, which in essence enabled people to be able to deal with the idea of death. And for this reason, many sort of rituals started appearing where they would delay death, okay, and they would actually have music and quite a loud environment in some kind of cultures, because that sort of originated on the idea that just in case that individual is alive, they might respond and we may get some kind of reaction before we are going to make that serious commitment of actually burying this individual. Now, this is what this really suggests, that these are some great recognized scholars historically who have clearly outlined that death is not really certain. So you will find in legal text of the different schools many different signs. So alamat al-zahiriyah, these are sort of physical signs, somatic sensory perception that we can actually analyze these signs, which are listed in many texts. So there are signs like, for example, the sinking of the temple, the bending of the nose, interestingly, the relaxation of the wrists, and many other sort of similar kind of signs, which if we look at today, we think, whoa, if I was to bury somebody on the basis of that, I'll probably bury quite a few of you by now. So, on that basis, they were not as clear as people would consider today. So, I would really question how many people actually use those as distinct signs to actually decide that somebody was dead. Now, so this is all we have. The Quran is not clear, okay? It's not explicit. There are certain implicit messages that we sometimes take from the Quran in relation to death, mainly in terms of the lugha and the language. Hadith, there are some expressions in the hadith, but I'll make reference to that in a short while. But the main point to take from here is these particular statements from some of these scholars, which clearly identify that. And one thing I want to point out, which is quite important here is these statements are related to the fear of burying somebody alive. And what people were doing was, and the whole idea of mortuaries arose on that basis that you leave them there because you're not sure, you leave them there, and then you give it a few days and then see, if they are, going to respond. And clearly if they don't respond, then you'll assume they're dead. Yeah? Now, the other sort of point to take from here, but that's not safe. You can't leave a dead body around. So mortuaries arose as a result of that, as a kind of a safe place from the health and safety perspective to keep the dead body in that particular place. Now, so this is the first thing. The next point to make from here, sorry, just moved on the wrong direction, is from an epistemological point of view, when we look at the Sharia, okay, where can we now say that, okay, looking at the fuqaha, remember, and we're going back to the metaphysical discussion again, we have signed up to a certain rubric to make a decision that somebody has died. Okay, I'm saying that in a very loose way. So whichever way we decide to define death, there are certain principles that we are following. So whichever way you decide, I'm going to now say that this person has died through this particular systematic way, you are signing up to some kind of principle. Okay, so on that basis, certainty, yaqeen, okay, is considered as very, quite definitive. Yeah. Then you have the predominant conjecture. And these are the two areas I really want to focus on. A shak would be something which would fall approximately 50. And fuqaha usually describe this as somewhere where the consideration in either end of it being definitive and not definitive is 50-50. Well, basically it falls equally on either end, hence 50. So in other words, we have this scope where we can give a preference which is more conjectural, but yet it gives us some element of conviction that we've come to a conclusion that this person has actually died is satisfactory in Islam. So when we say that it has to be yaqeen, yaqeen is used interchangeably, even in the books of fiqh, because some fuqaha, they use the idea of yaqeen and ghalabat al-dhann interchangeably. When they use the word yaqeen, what they actually mean is ghalabat al-dhann. But that's a separate discussion. Like I said, there's a number of slides that fall in between here that give a greater level of explanation. Right, now, so there's two questions we need to ask, okay, about investigating human death. We now have gained some kind of idea about the epistemic sort of knowledge that is required to be able to ascertain death. There are two main questions that we need to ask. What is human death? And to even ask that question, we need to have some kind of perception of, or some kind of understanding about what is human life, okay, and that's come to an end. And the other is about how can we determine that it has occurred. But when we talk about what is human death, it's an ontological discussion, because, or a conceptual one, because what we're doing is we can't just say, right, this is a point where that person has died. It's not as simple as that. You have to come out with some kind of standard. So you would say that, and we'll talk about the three standards that are prevalent, but generally speaking, you have to come to some kind of conclusion about some kind of standard that you will accept that a death has occurred. And that's not good enough, because the other thing that you need to do is now you need to ensure that the tools that you use or the tests that you use have to be quite determinate in being able to come to that standard and give you some kind of conviction that you've achieved that standard. So there are two main concepts here that need to really be dealt with. So these are the three different concepts of death that or standards of death that we recognize. So the first is the traditional. So those who want to sign up to the traditional basically talk about irreversible loss of vital fluid flow, cessation of the heart and lung, absence of the pulse. And this is a quite an obvious one. And the reason why it's obvious, because historically this is the one that everybody has fallen on by default, okay? Because we don't have that level of understanding other than to accept this. We don't have a choice but to accept this. Then there's the whole brain death, or the brainstem death, which is to do with the irreversible loss of integrating capacity. Okay, and this is to do with the cessation of whole brain function, and we've got the Harvard criteria and others. And then we have the interesting higher brain death. This is about personhood. So when does this individual no longer become a person? Okay, and that's the third criteria. And that's sort of about cessation of this higher brain function. which I'm going to talk about in quite a bit of detail in a short while. So if we are going to accept and compare and contrast this whole brain death and the traditional understanding of death, then we really sort of should approach this first by understanding two particular main features. One is the organismic definition of death. When do we say that an organism as a whole has died? What particular philosophical concept do we have to accept to be able to ensure that that's what's happened? The second is an emphasis, and basically this is to accept the whole brain death. What you're emphasizing that the brain's role as a primary integrator of integrated bodily functioning, that the brain is the primary integrator. Okay, so these are the two sort of main areas that we need to look at. Why is the first one important? The first one is important because when we look at death, what kind of system has to be triggered? What cascade needs to really initiate for us to say now that this person has died? And that is that it has to be a collapse of the integrated bodily functioning. Okay, so number one, there's a concept of integrated bodily functioning, and then that has collapsed. So any kind of organism, be it an amoeba to a human, if there's an integrated bodily function that functions and controls the whole, if that has gone, then inevitably what will happen is you're going to get a degeneration immediately after, and that thing will die. In a similar way, we need to look at the human in a similar kind of way. So what is this integrated bodily functioning that we can pinpoint in the human, for example, in that respect? And the second point is, so the brain is this particular primary integrator. Okay, so that's the question. Now this is a very sort of positivist, materialistic approach to the understanding of death. So I spend quite a lot of time, and this sort of fulfills about another 15 slides or something, just on the discussion of Kalam. I have no intention of going through Kalam, okay? But there is a quite extensive discussion, and I'll just briefly outline. So we're talking about Imam Baghdadi and Al-Ansari and various scholars, discuss Kalam, and this mainly the Ash'ari school. And what they talk about the concept of occasionalism and atomism, that's a separate discussion. But they actually then start looking at the human in an interesting way as atoms. Okay, not atoms as we see atoms in science today, but a very different description, whereby there is no integration. Okay, so the man is not integrated. Material things are not integrated. Okay, there are certain attributes that they have, but they have a relationship which is independent of the other. One atom has no relationship with the other. There's no cause and effect type relationship. That sort of suggests that we are going to struggle with this whole idea of integrated human body as a result of this. So the interesting thing is there's a lot of debate during the Kalam period historically. So there was a real need to start looking at an integrated idea of the person for a number of different reasons. Because when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically calls you as arif, or any kind of attribute is given to you, am I giving that attribute to individual atoms in your body which have no relationship with the other? Or am I giving it to you as a person, something that's already integrated? So on that basis, the discussion went on, and then the ruh, okay, the soul, I will use, and this word again, like Asim mentioned, is used quite interchangeably. So I will use the word soul for ease purposes. Okay, so the soul is that integrating, or the primary integrator. Okay, and there are textual evidences or scriptural evidences to suggest that. Okay, so the first thing is there's a collapse of integrated bodily function. From an Islamic point of view, the human body integration and life or death, when we look at it from this point of view, the soul is that integrator. So when the soul departs, okay, then we die. So there are many verses of the Quran which indicate this. There are many explicit and implicit accounts. But the most importantly, the ulama are agreed that it's the soul, so that when that departs of life from the body, is basically there's a departure of life from the body, and the soul leaves the body. And so this is quite clear. Okay. Now, clear in the sense that that's what that means, but what does that mean for us as physicians, as doctors, or even as philosophers? Okay? So this has a number of implications. So many have attempted to give some kind of explanation to this. And remember, going back to this idea, we can't achieve certainty, but yet we have to come to some kind of conclusion about death. We have to. We don't have a choice. We're being cornered. Okay? With the kind of technology we have today, we have to decide a point where we will say this person has died. We can't just keep them there forever. So on that basis, if we make reference to those who have given a quite interesting account of what it means when the soul leaves the body and how we describe that, we come to the individuals like, you know, the great Imam Ghazali, and also Ibn Qayyum, who was a traditionalist. Okay, so he carried weight just on the basis that traditionalists generally tend to, because they take a more literal understanding of the Quran and the prophetic tradition. So on that basis, you'll see here, and I'll just make mention of some really important words here, even though the Arabic is important here. I'm just elaborating on the meaning rather than the individual words. So the meaning of the soul parting from the body is the separation of the control of its actions from the body. Now, this sort of indicates there's a cause and effect relationship between the soul. If we accept the idea that the soul is immaterial, okay, so there has been a bit of a debate historically between scholars about whether the soul is truly material, immaterial, or a subtle body, jism al-latif, okay? So there's quite a bit of discussion about that. But we have issues with this now, because if we start saying that the soul is, you know, a subtle body, then that sort of indicates to some extent that we can empirically pick up on the soul. So we need to be very careful when we say that, okay? But then we learned very recently that even something that is considered as, Ibn Qayyum, the interesting thing about what he says is he says that it is material, but it is of a different mahiyah, a different kind of quiddity. Now, what does that mean? An interesting discussion. But I'm going to leave that suspended, that discussion, for the moment. But the most important thing here is this relationship between the soul leaving the body and the functional ability of the body. In what capacity? What kind of things are we looking at here? So the second part, if you remember, was the issue about the brain's role as a primary integrator. So life involves integrated functioning of the whole organism. Okay, so we'll accept that. The brain makes all of these vital functions. That's what we understand. So the brain is a primary integrator. We understand from science. So although heartbeat and breathing normally indicate life, and we can see that they do, okay, they don't actually constitute life, and that's important to understand. Okay, just because you've got what you do is you're suspending the whole idea of life on the basis of two organs that are functioning. Okay, and that can be quite problematic. So we accept many different standards. There's the brainstem standard and so forth. My appeal is to the high brain approach. Okay, and the reason why that's important is because if we're going to look at the idea of an integrated self or a body, and it's the collapse of this integrated body that's important, then somebody can argue and say, but there are other processes that are integrated, which are independent of the brain, such as homeostasis, the ability to control temperature, and various other things. And it's an integrated sort of system that works in our body. So why should we just solely focus on the brain being that sort of integrated whole? So that really takes us that we need to appeal to the essence of a human person. What is the essence of a human person? If that goes, that human is no longer a person. So if the soul is gone, that human is no longer a person. Okay? So I'm using these words very carefully. Human and person. There is a distinction between the two. Okay, anyway, the main point is there are two main ontological concepts that we would have to accept here. Number one, that we either identify the organism or biological body which comes into existence at conception and shortly thereafter dies when the organismic functions. So this is about a biological view of the body and death. So we look at it when every cell dies, that's when we are happy that this individual has now died. Or we take on this other view, the minded being who comes into existence when sentience of volition emerges. Now, I can't just say sentience of volition and just leave it at that, but I have to support this through fiqh, okay? And there's this particular slide that does that. And this is a case where an individual has been basically assaulted with a knife, and basically he collapses on the floor, and the only thing that he has is some element. The fuqaha, they look at this. They look at the idea. And they come to this conclusion that we can actually give a penalty of qisas, okay, to an individual on assaulting this individual solely on the basis of sentience volition. If this individual, even if he's moving, okay, that's considered as involuntary movement. But if the sentience and volition has gone, and this is called the idea behind it is harakat al-mazbuh. If that is gone, then that person is considered as dead. The slide explains the rest. Okay, you can just read that. I'll leave that for a minute while I walk towards my chair. Okay, but this is quite an important thing. So for those of us who have a very fiqhy approach to this, you know, there is something to take in terms of value from this particular slide. Okay, inshallah. So I finish on these last few words. And this has an impact on organ transplantation, withdrawal of treatment. That's quite massive impact in terms of when do we decide that somebody has died, when that person has lost personhood. And personhood is to do with sentience, volition, etc. Okay, inshallah, I'm sure you'll have many, many questions to ask me, and I will prepare for them as I sit down on that chair. Jazakumullah khair.